Alright folks, today I'm here to take you through the story as well as give you my thoughts on the 9th volume of the Walking Dead comics, Here We Remain, which is the first chapter of Compendium 2. Now, I know it's been a while since the last installment, which you guys have been sure to let me know, but if you haven't seen my videos covering the previous volumes up to this point, I'd highly recommend checking those out beforehand, as I will not be reintroducing the characters or plot lines we first encountered in those installments, which may lead to some confusion as the comic up to this point has differed quite a bit from the show. But I will give a small recap of the last chapter before we get started to get you on track. After all the craziness of the last installment, Volume 9 reels the action back, but puts the mental state of our remaining survivors at the forefront. My videos do not compare to reading the actual comic for yourself in any way. I use minimal panels, and naturally, a lot of the small interactions that make up the heart of the series get left behind when conveying the grander story. So I'd highly recommend picking up Volume 9 or Compendium 2 for yourself. Links will be in the description. This version of the story is quite similar to the show, but still features enough changes to differentiate itself. So I'm excited to hear what you guys think about it in the comments down below. And with that, if you end up enjoying this video, please consider hitting that like button and drop a sub to see more content like this. After a period of what seemed like peace within the prison, the governor's forces suddenly and viciously attacked with everything they had. But despite catching our survivors off guard, Andrea was able to repel the initial attack. However, after going out on a rogue mission to take out the governor before a second hit, Tyrese had gotten himself captured and beheaded at the horror of Rick and company. Rick had sustained a gunshot wound to his abdomen, and many of our survivors fled in fear. But those who hung back to defend the prison were subjected to the bloodiest event in the series yet, as Axel, Patricia, Billy, Herschel, Alice, as well as Judith and Lori were lost in the attack, while Brian Blake, the governor himself, fell at the hands of his own soldiers as a consequence of his horrific actions. And with that, the prison now lies in ruin as our survivors are scattered into the wasteland. Well, at least those who are still breathing. As Michonne scouts the aftermath of the battle, she locates and puts down the reanimated head of Tyrese, a man she has grown closer to than any other throughout the outbreak so far, which clearly takes a toll as she was partially responsible for leading the charge against the governor, resulting in his death. In the wreckage of the RV, a roamer reaches out at Michonne that, from what I could find, was an unnamed Woodbury soldier. However, I personally have always interpreted this panel as Michonne believing Rick had died, or at least momentarily, as this walker is eerily similar in design with its right hand covered in the panel. But despite the overwhelming feeling of despair, a set of footprints leading away from the prison had given her purpose, as she may not have been the only survivor after all. Whether these were the prints of a friend or foe was yet to be seen. However, we know exactly who they belong to as we pick back up with Rick and Carl on the road following the death of Lori and Judith. This is the first time they've been alone in the wild without direction. And now that Rick was missing a hand, he wouldn't even be able to open a can of food without the help of his son. Carl would assist his father, but was clearly feeling resentment towards Rick as he was starting to believe he couldn't keep anyone safe anymore, including his family. The governor was out there all that time, and they just stood behind the fence and waited for him to attack. And because of this inaction, his mother and sister died. Carl had already been hardened by the horrors faced so far, but now that they were alone in the wilderness, he was gonna have to grow up rapidly if they were gonna survive. But at the end of the day, he is only 8 or 9, so in his eyes, even the slightest close call required he take action by firing his gun despite Rick begging him not to, further reinforcing his belief his father can no longer protect him. However, it seems Rick kind of understood where Carl was coming from in not wanting to take risks, as he then grabs his gun to put down another roamer, as if he realized he needs to reel himself back and understand his physical limitations if the two are going to make it through this dark time. But taking shelter in an abandoned house for the night, Carl eats the scraps of cereal the two found while looting as Rick attempts to clean his bullet wound with whatever he can find in the medicine cabinet. It's clear he was nowhere near healed up enough to be out there, but he attempts to play down his wounds in order to not worry Carl. But the kid was already worried about so much. What were they gonna do now? What if others survived? What if they could find them somewhere? But all his father could suggest was to stay put and hope they come to them. More inaction, which he tries to understand, but is reminded of the loss of his mother, which brings him to tears once again. What he really needs right now is to talk about his grief, but as no response comes from his father after telling him he misses his mom, Carl realizes Rick has fallen unconscious from his wounds, causing him to panic before falling back in fear as he briefly believed his father had turned. But thankfully for now, he was alive, just very sick. And after spending the night crying on his unconscious shoulder, Carl would snap under the stress once again and demand Rick wake up as tears pour down his face. Very akin to the show version, although I think this segment works a bit better in the comic due to his younger age. But as a cruel reminder of this world's unforgiving nature, roamers begin clawing at the door, attracted by the sound of his grief. Although he didn't know where to go without his father, he did know how to take out the dead, so leading the two away as not to attract more to their house, Carl had tripped and nearly gotten himself killed. But against all odds, he was able to put them down without getting himself bit, which causes him to throw up from the adrenaline, but smile with pride after, as this now confirmed everything he had been feeling. He can take care of himself. And with this epiphany, he returns to his father and finally puts his frustrations into words. He couldn't protect Lori or Judith. He couldn't protect Alice, Tyrese, Donna, Alan, or anyone. And now he knows Rick can't protect him. Only Carl can do that. So, accepting his father's fate by telling him he will be okay if he dies, Carl sits for hours watching him and reflecting on what he said until nightfall. But as Rick once again rises while groaning as if turned, Carl immediately surrenders while going back on his words. He thought he could take care of himself, but what he can't handle is being alone. He was strong, but this was no place for a kid to survive by himself. So, embracing his fate as his father approaches, Rick would shock Carl by faintly whispering for him to stay inside at all costs. He was still alive, but all his son could do was hold him while letting him know just how scared he truly was. Following this scare, many nights and many days would pass before Rick was back on his feet. And although he still felt as if a horse kicked him in the stomach, it seemed the two were at a much better spot in their relationship. Carl had proven to be tough, especially compared to some of the other kids in the prison, but here we get a really nice reminder that he is just a boy as he asks his father to come sit with him in another room while he reads. A small moment that adds so much to his character, which this series is absolutely filled with. Without a doubt, this is the point in the series where Carl starts to become one of the most intriguing characters, so be sure to keep a closer eye on him going forward. The two have been surviving off canned food and scraps from the surrounding area as Rick had been teaching Carl how to properly loot and what to look for. However, in an odd turn of events while out and about, Rick would suddenly begin sprinting back to the house while claiming to hear the phone ringing. And to his surprise, after picking it up, a female voice on the other side would sound just as shocked to hear a response. The woman claims to be a part of a larger group who may be willing to take them in if they give her some time to talk to the others, which he very warmly agrees to. The whole situation left Rick shocked, but delighted at the same time that in the middle of all of this, a phone was still working, although until they called back, the two were still gonna need to eat. However, while out hunting, Carl would learn a tragic lesson in the apocalypse as the two had heard and witnessed a man fall to the dead while screaming for help. Nothing they could have done would have saved him, But after discovering his fully stocked car nearby without any signs of struggle, the two had come to the realization the man had chosen his fate, just as Carol did all those issues ago, reinforcing the idea of how dangerous the loss of hope can be in this world. But the next day, Rick continues to talk to the woman over the phone where she is still apprehensive to give them their location, but again asks for a bit more time in convincing the others. The two now have a working car, and although the man's food supplies was doing them well, sooner or later they were gonna run out. So although Rick obliges, he clearly becomes more antsy over the following days, as he states they're gonna have to move on if she's not gonna reveal where they are. But at the very least, the woman agrees to give him their number in the event they find another working phone. Although, in trying to form a better connection with the woman who could possibly be their savior before they leave, Rick asks if she could, at the very least, give him her name. And to his shock and horror, the woman states it's Lori. Rushing over to the plug in the wall, Rick rips it out only to still hear her voice crackling through. She attempts to tell him all that happened wasn't his fault, but Rick just can't believe it. If he evacuated the prison, they'd all still be alive, and all he can do now is tell her how sorry he is. But as he questions his sanity in asking if she's actually real, she tells him of course she's not, which practically shatters him inside, as he tells Carl they are leaving right now as that woman was crazy and dangerous. They should just forget about them altogether. I absolutely love Rick's portrayal of grief through this plot device. It just works so well in both versions of the story in their own ways. The show portrays it as a full-on breakdown, while the comic portrays it as a more subtle, somber loss of sanity as he tries to keep it under wraps for the sake of his son, both of which are masterfully done in their respective stories. But what I love most about the comic version is that Rick takes the phone with him as they leave, showing how despite knowing it's not real and more than likely isn't a good coping mechanism, he can't resist giving in to the only sense of connection he still has with his wife. But now that Rick knew no salvation was coming, the two were back to square one, attempting to figure out what to do next. So hitting the road in their newly found car while trying to teach Carl how to drive in order to survive on his own if they ever get separated, the two would get into a heated back and forth as Carl believed he was treating him like a baby since he was really learning as preparation for when Rick died, which Rick doesn't deny but assures it's just in case the worst were to ever happen before going out to siphon some fuel. However, while searching through the broken down trucks scattered around, a roamer had snuck up behind Carl and pressed him against the car, and just before it could sink its teeth into the terrified boy, the distinct blade of a katana would stop it in place, revealing Michonne had finally caught up to the two after days of tracking their trail. Without saying another word, Carl jumps in her arms out of gratitude as the three reconvene. After expecting to find more Woodbury soldiers to kill, finding these two instead was surely a much welcome surprise. I have to be honest here though, the show does this reunion a billion times better, which was always going to be the case since they had already established a close relationship between the three within the prison, whereas the comic really didn't. But just the fact Michonne feels the need to ask if she can tag along really conveys how much more focus was put on Michonne's relationships with others in the show. But now, as a group of three, our survivors continue their journey within the car as the only place Rick can think to go at the moment is Herschel's farm, which should have been their rendezvous spot in the show, but I digress. However, he greatly misjudged how far it was, so setting up camp for the night on the side of the road so Carl can get some sleep, Rick and Michonne have a much needed heart-to-heart where they discuss what happened, their guilt for surviving when so many didn't, and their regrets for their actions that led to this situation in the first place. But just as the sun arises, their conversation is interrupted by two mysterious figures approaching on horseback, revealing themselves as Glenn and Maggie, alive and well as they've been scouting for survivors since the prison. And although everyone is glad to see each other, it isn't exactly a happy reunion as Rick is forced to tell Maggie about the loss of both Herschel and Billy. Maggie is now the sole survivor of the Green family, making for a rather somber ride back as we learn anyone else who made it out of the prison had already reconvened at Herschel's farm, those of which being Andrea, who survived the RV crash with little injury, Dale, Ben, Billy, and Sophia. This is it. These are all the faces who survived the conflict with the governor. But despite all the tragic news, everyone was happy to be reunited, and those who did make it out were now closer than ever over their shared trauma. That night, Carl struggles to understand how some of the other kids around him, such as Sophia, are so naive to what's going on, as he clearly is seeing the world from an adult's perspective when the others are not. But Rick attempts to bring him back down as he conveys how others process grief in different ways. But in a way, Rick was talking about himself as well as he confides in Dale about the losses they faced. They don't blame him for what happened, but Rick certainly still blames himself entirely for the attack. So now, he's ready to follow the others' lead. They've only gotten a few roamers a day at the farm, so at this point, all he cares about is keeping Carl safe, both physically and mentally. But before turning in for the night, he overhears Michonne talking to herself much like Andrea had in the past, which she confesses to Rick was her way of coping with the loss of her boyfriend in the early days, which Rick now understands all too well as he shows her the phone he took from the house and explains the story around it, which I think is a much needed conversation that gets the two on track to have that best friend dynamic later on. But for now, it was time for bed, which naturally is interrupted by a single gunshot mere hours later. Rushing outside with his weapon at the ready, Andrea stands on the roof with three strangers held at gunpoint. The three are armed, but lay down their weapons as they claim to have only stopped to search for supplies. However, the commotion had caused a couple roamers to break through the fence, which gives the leading man a chance to show off his skills in combat. Another man claims every shot fired raises the chances of multiple roamers culminating into what they refer to as a herd, a destructive undead force capable of ripping this farm to pieces. So it would be in their best interest to keep the fighting to a minimum. In the midst of the chaos, Rick asks for everyone to calm down, understanding they don't appear to be an immediate threat, where the leading man then introduces himself as Sergeant Abraham Ford, along with his companions Rosita Espinoza and Dr. Eugene Porter, who of which are on a mission to get Eugene to research facilities in Washington, D.C., as he claims to know exactly what caused the outbreak. Stating to have worked for a human genome project when the outbreak hit, Eugene claims Washington is equipped with the right infrastructure to stop this whole mess once and for all, as he has regularly been in contact with scientists within the capital, but didn't want to risk killing batteries by communicating too often. However, some, such as Andrea, aren't buying the bullshit and demand to know what it was that caused this plague as she raises her gun to Eugene's head, right before getting it flipped around by Abraham, who begins telling them exactly how it is. The information Eugene knows is classified, but after losing his family to the dead while witnessing his genius in action, Abraham furiously expresses how he devoted his life's purpose to getting him to Washington as a way to make up his mistakes to those he lost. It was a heated introduction, but Abraham is able to reel himself in and apologize while insisting they're not there to hurt them. They simply need a place to stay for the night, which the group allows as long as they keep their distance. But the next morning, everyone seems to be in a much calmer headspace as Abraham personally apologizes for hitting Andrea, explaining he's simply a man devoted to a mission who forgets how to act appropriately sometimes. However, their conversation is interrupted when a small herd arrives to break down the fence once again, just as they said would happen. So single-handedly taking out the dead, Abe proves the need to band together as he scolds our survivors for just sitting here and waiting to die. This farm will eventually fall, whether that's from a much larger herd or a group of raiders. They are leaving in a couple hours and could greatly use the extra manpower. So now is the time for our group to decide what they want their fate to be. Will they continue to struggle and pray what he says doesn't come to pass, or will they take hold of their lives and attempt to make the world a better place for their children? For the most part, our survivors see Abraham's point, and with Maggie grieving her family, the last place she wanted to be was in this house. So making the decision as a group with Rick refusing to dictate their direction, everyone begins to pack with the prospect of heading to Washington. However, this will be a long and dangerous journey with strangers they don't fully know who are still capable of showing a different side. So talking to Carl in private, Rick tells his son no matter who's watching, no matter how clear an area seems, he is not safe. And if he lets his guard down even for a second, it could all be over. So with his son's promise of remaining vigilant, Rick and company pile into their vehicles as Abraham leads the way to, hopefully, a better future. Alright folks, and that was The Walking Dead Volume 9, Here We Remain. Now, personally, I've always enjoyed the solo story with Carl more in the comics, as his younger age just makes the fear of being alone hit so much harder, and it really began my intrigue in his character going forward, which was very much needed when approaching future story arcs such as Fear the Hunters. The cutting room floor behind the scenes book explains how Rick and Carl were supposed to struggle with survival even harder, as they would have had to drink boiled toilet water while facing stray dogs, which would have been really cool to see, but there are only so many pages in a comic, so it is what it is. Overall, I really enjoy the toned down action after the craziness that was Made to Suffer, as we got to see a deeper look at some of our most central characters. But these are just my opinions, and I'd love to hear what you thought about Volume 9 in the comments down below. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.